War has always been told through the eyes of soldiers, through battles, maps, and the men who fought that war. But there's another story, one that ran through trenches, crossed battlefields, and stood watch in the dark beside them. A story carried on 4 legs. From the mud of World War I to the global scale and trenches of World War II, dogs weren't just present, they were messengers, sentries, rescuers, and sometimes the difference between life and death. This is the chapter of America's dogs that went to war.
The war didn't start with dogs. It started in the trenches. In World War I, the battlefield became something the world had never seen before. Miles of mud, barbed wire, and silence broken by artillery. Men lived in narrow trenches, surrounded by the constant threat of attack and something worse, gas. It came without warning, rolling low across the ground, invisible at first, then burning the lungs of anyone caught too late. But it wasn't just the attacks that wore men down. It was what lived beside them. Rats moved through the trenches in waves, drawn to food, to waste, to the bodies that couldn't always be recovered. They chewed through supplies, spread disease, and turned already unbearable conditions into something even worse. And in that space, dogs began to matter as part of survival. Small, fast, relentless. Some dogs were used to hunt and kill the rats, bringing a small but critical measure of control to a place where almost nothing could be controlled. Others stayed close to the men, mascots, companions. But it didn't take long for soldiers to notice something else. Dogs reacted before humans did. They would stiffen, grow alert, sometimes refuse to move forward, long before danger was visible, before the gas, before the enemy, before the sound of incoming fire. What started as companionship quickly became something more: awareness, warning, survival. And sometimes the story didn't end on the battlefield. American soldiers brought dogs home with them. Some have been found in the chaos, abandoned, surviving, holding on. Others had served alongside them. One of those dogs would go on to become known as Rin Tin Tin, a puppy found during the war and carried back to the United States, where his story didn't end in the trenches, but began a completely different kind of legacy. And soon the role of dogs in war would change forever. Meanwhile, on the home front, while much of life for dogs stayed the same, something was starting to shift. Most dogs were still outside, still working, still living close to, but not fully inside, the home. But around the time of World War I, new systems were beginning to take hold. For the first time, there was a growing expectation of ownership and responsibility. Licensing laws spread across cities. Collars and tags became more than optional. They identified who a dog belonged to. Leash laws began appearing, especially in growing urban areas trying to control stray populations. But the biggest changes were happening in how dogs were cared for. Veterinary medicine was no longer just for farm animals. It was beginning to include dogs. Early veterinary clinics were simple, nothing like today. No advanced imaging, no specialty care. But there were trained veterinarians, basic surgical tools, and a growing understanding of disease. Rabies was one of the first major focuses. Vaccination efforts were developing. not widespread yet, but no longer unheard of. There were also early treatments for parasites, basic wound care, and a shift away from relying only on home remedies. And for the first time, people could buy food made specifically for dogs. Products like Sprat's dog cakes had already been introduced, but now commercial dog food was becoming more available in the United States, changing how some dogs were fed. At the same time, organizations like the American Kennel Club continued to grow, standardizing breeds and expanding dog shows. Dogs were being defined in new ways, not just by what they did, but by how they looked, how they were bred, and increasingly, how they were cared for. So while many dogs still lived as they always had, the foundation for the modern American dog was quietly being built. By the time the United States entered World War II, dogs were no longer an afterthought. They were organized, trained, assigned, and for the first time, they became part of the United States military structure. The backbone of that effort came through the United States Army, through its War Dog program, often called the Canine Corps. Dogs were trained for specific roles built around what they could do better than any human. Messenger dogs carried critical information across dangerous ground when radios failed or silence was required. Scout dogs moved ahead of troops, their senses detecting threats long before they could be seen. Sentry dogs stood guard, alerting to movement in the dark before danger reached the line. And others were trained to search for the wounded, finding soldiers left behind and guiding help to them. Dogs were used where they made the greatest impact. In the United States Marine Corps, their role became especially visible. In places like Guam, Doberman Pinschers patrolled dense jungle terrain, warning of enemy presence and protecting Marines in environments where visibility was limited and danger could be just feet away. Other branches saw more limited use. The United States Coast Guard used dogs primarily for coastal patrol and base security. In the United States Navy and the United States Merchant Marine, dogs were more often mascots than trained war dogs, a presence aboard ships, but not part of a structured combat program like those on land. So while dogs were seen across the military, their true impact came where the war demanded it most, on the ground, where sight was limited, where communication could fail, and where survival depended on sensing danger before it arrived. And in those moments, they didn't hesitate, because to them, this wasn't about branches or structure, it was loyalty. Meanwhile, on the home front, while much of life for dogs still looked familiar, even more was changing. By the time World War II reached full scale, dogs in America were living in a country at war, even if they never left home. Food was rationed, and that didn't just affect people. Pet owners were encouraged to feed dogs differently, using table scraps, stretching meals, and in some cases, struggling to keep them fed at all. At the same time, dogs were being called into service from the home front. Through programs tied to the U.S. Army's war dog efforts, families were asked to donate their dogs for military training. Some did, and not every one of those dogs came back. But alongside that sacrifice, the way Americans saw their dogs continued to shift. Veterinary care was becoming more reliable, still basic by today's standards, but more accessible, more trusted, and more focused on companion animals than ever before. Vaccinations, especially for rabies, were becoming more common. Knowledge of parasites, infection, and nutrition was improving, and commercial dog food continued to grow, even with wartime shortages. Training was changing too. More Americans were beginning to see dogs as something that could be trained with purpose, not just for work, but for behavior, control, and companionship. And organizations like the American Kennel Club continue to define breeds and standards, even as the country focused on war. So while some dogs were overseas, others were part of a different kind of effort, living through rationing, training, adapting, and becoming something closer to what we recognize today. Because by the end of the war, the American dog wasn't just changing on the battlefield, it was changing at home. The war changed dogs, not just on the battlefield, but at home. Dogs had proven something. In war, they were more than companions. They were capable, trainable, essential, and Americans saw it. They saw what dogs can do under pressure, how they worked, how they bonded, how they stayed, no matter the cost. And that didn't stay overseas. It came home. The training methods developed during the war began to influence how dogs were handled in everyday life. Obedience, purpose, communication. These weren't just military ideas anymore. They became part of the growing relationship between Americans and their dogs. At the same time, everything happening on the home front, the rise of veterinary care, more consistent feeding, growing structure through organizations like the American Kennel Club, all of it was building towards something new, the modern American dog. Not just a worker, not just a protector, but a companion with a defined place in both the home and the world beyond it. Because by the end of World War II, dogs had earned something they never had before: recognition.
War didn't just test nations, it revealed something. That when everything else broke down, communication, safety, certainty, dogs didn't. They were there. On the battlefield, they stood their ground. At home, they became something they had never been before. Not just workers, not just companions, but part of something deeper, a bond that had been building for generations and now was impossible to ignore. Because in the hardest moments, when survival mattered most, they stayed, they served, they belonged. We weren't separate because we have always been a pack. In next week's episode, we talk about a dog made famous in World War I and also a dog made famous in World War II.
This is America 250, The Dogs. This has been episode 10.